Why? Because those life and death happen independently of those processes. On the other hand, they're personifications of the process of karma. That's what the 10 kings are. They administer a process. But I've never seen a description that the demon is turning the wheel. Just linguistically, you do find such a description in the description of the 10th king of hell. In Chinese, he's the Wu Dao Zhuan Lun Wang, right? The king who turns the wheel, who turns the wheel of the 5 paths, right? So that gets. It's not quite there, but that's the one reference to wheel turning in this kind of mythology. The figure himself, the figure is called in the. I know the Chinese text, and I got a lot of help in working my way through part of the Sanskrit text, and I don't read Tibetan. I was a Tibetan dropout, so this Vinaya exists in all 3 languages, translated in different time periods, but there's. The Chinese calls him simply Wu Chang Da Gui, the great demon of impermanence. Right? The Sanskrit does not call him Yama, nor does the Tibetan. I forget what they do call him. I don't think it's the Sanskrit version of impermanence, which would be anicca. It's not anicca raja or anicca and then dima, anicca roga, something like that. But the artists decide how to paint him, and so most of the Tibetan artists use an iconography that is the iconography for depicting Yama. In Tibetan iconography, that's King Yama, but I'm not sure that's what he is at Ajanta. Ajanta, you can only see a few fingernails. I'm not sure I don't think that's what the demon is at Dazu, at Baolingshan, for instance. It doesn't look like Yama to me. So I don't know who it is, and in the Chinese it only says Wu Chang Da Gui.
I remember I read the sutra Han Jing, especially the 3 poison turn the wheel off. The 3 poison?
Yes. Sandu. Yeah. The Han Jing you've read. It's one of the longest collections of sutras, and it's very basic, important Buddhism. So from your confirmation, that I think tells us that, or at least my interpretation is that this is very basic. It's almost universal in Buddhism. The teachings contained in the canonical wheel of rebirth, because they contain these very basic teachings: 3 poisons, 5 paths, 6 paths of rebirth, 12-fold chain of dependent origination, wheel of samsara.
I just have one term that I'd like for you to maybe explain, because that should fit in the wheel of rebirth. There's a term called, in Chinese, it's 转轮圣王. And in fact, many kings or many rulers along the Silk Road in Asia Minor during the medieval period, in fact, were interested in becoming one. So that's why they sponsored Buddhism, or different forms of Buddhism along the Silk Road. And so what does 转轮圣王 fit, or how do they fit in this particular rule of rebirth?
They don't. They're different. They don't fit. That's the short answer. Let me explain a little bit. It's a very interesting question. Not all wheels are the same, even in Buddhism. The underlying mythology. I go back to the underlying mythology which began in India, but of course is carried through with all the Buddhist civilizations, including China, to understand the idea behind Zhuanglong Shenglong. The Sanskrit form of that is the Chakravartin Raja. Chakra is wheel. I don't think the verb Zhuan is translated directly from the Sanskrit. So but the idea of wheel and the idea of a holy king, a Raja, is a king. It goes back to the same root for a ruler. So a ruler who turns the wheel is how I understand the original Sanskrit. So then the question is, well, what's the wheel that he's turning? What does that have to do? And again, it's also tied up with Buddhism, although it's independent of Buddhism as well in early Indian mythology. Buddhist sources talk about different kinds of kings and how they rule. And powerful kings who use weapons rule by using literally a weapon in the shape of a wheel that's made of metal, like a discus, a whirling steel weapon. And they have to use metal wheels. But a truly enlightened ruler is someone who rules by the power of the Dharma chakra, so the Falun. So what pops to mind, of course, Falun Gong, is using that original idea, those two basic ideas, right? It's a metaphor that the wheel, that the law, that the Dharma, the truth of the universe, is like a wheel. That's how an enlightened ruler rules. He does not need force. He rules through the wheel of the Dharma. And in the same Hanjing, there are descriptions of how a righteous ruler essentially is accompanied by some kind of actual wheel that pops up out of the earth and accompanies him magically throughout the world wherever he goes. But usually it's just the idea, one is setting in motion the law. And so the Buddha's first sermon at the deer park is called the Dharma Chakra Pravartana. And my Sanskrit is almost as bad as my Tibetan. But that refers to the setting in motion, Pravartana, of the wheel of the law, of the Dharma Chakra. So here's another use of the wheel, setting it in motion. It's what the Buddha does when he preaches. What he preaches is the Dharma, and that's, again, we use a metaphor to describe it. He sets in motion the wheel of the law. Right? So the Buddha's doing something with the Dharma as a wheel. So is the righteous king. And that's where the symbolism comes from. Another great source is the description of the demise of the Buddha, the parinirvana of the Buddha, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, in which it says that you're supposed to treat the remains of a Buddha the same as you treat the remains of a Zhuanglong Shenglong, a world-ruling monarch. And they're supposed to be treated in the same way.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Teiser, for a wonderful talk, and thank you also for attending.
Yeah.